Great to see this wonderful gentleman, a real icon of the American intellectual world. John, please tell us what you're going to show to us.
This is billed as an Edge at DLD session. We've done quite a few. The first one was quite notable, was Richard Dawkins and Craig Venter talking about genetics and I think making a great breakthrough in public acceptance of the kind of work that Venter and George Church and Svante Pääbo are doing. A second one was Daniel Kahneman and Nassim Taleb. And nice thing about DLD is they have a lot of room for politicians talking about what has to be done. They have young startup people that are risk takers, very exciting. And Hubert always leaves room for the real science. So we appreciate that. Tonight's topic is on information. Svante Pääbo, a Swedish biologist, is the father of ancient DNA. He's the director of the Department of Genetics at Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. A lot of talk about disruption today. This man qualifies as a disruptor. He found the evolutionary changes in the language gene FOXP2, which is lacking in other species. He did the first demonstration of DNA survival in an ancient Egyptian mummy, the first amplification of ancient DNA, the first study of DNA from the Iceman found in the Alps, the first retrieval of DNA from a Neanderthal in 1997, and he organized the effort to sequence the entire Neanderthal genome. The first scientific overview was published in 2009. In 2010, he and his co-workers published a report about DNA analysis in the figure bone in the Denisova cave in Siberia. The results, the bone belongs to an extinct member of the genus Homo that had not yet been recognized. Would you mind, please? You know, we came all the way from New York. Thank you. Time magazine named him one of the most influential people in the world. He's the author of a new book, Neanderthal Man in Search of Lost Genomes, published here in March, published in the US next month. Anton Zeilinger was just elected president of the Austrian Academy of Science. He is an Austrian quantum physicist at the University of Vienna, scientific director, Institute of Quantum Optics and Quantum Information. He won the 2008 inaugural Isaac Newton Medal for the Institute of Physics in the UK for his pioneering conceptual and experimental contributions to the foundations of quantum physics, which have been the cornerstone of a rapidly evolving field of quantum information. Most of his research concerns fundamental aspects and applications of quantum entanglement. He's best known as a pioneer in the new field of quantum information. He's received worldwide attention for his first realization of quantum teleportation with photons and on quantum interference experiments with buckyball molecules. In terms of research, his next goal is to extend the realm of even larger objects, perhaps even to life itself. He's focusing on quantum communication on a global scale. He's the author of Dance of the Photons, from Einstein to Quantum Teleportation. We're going to start with Svante. Thank you.
Hey. Well, John asked us before that we should talk about the questions we ask ourselves here. So I gave it a little bit of thought before we came on stage here, and I think that perhaps the overarching question I ask myself since a year or so is how humans came to be such a very special form of ape as we are. So humans, as we know, are over 7 billion individuals on the planet. We live all over the globe, almost in every habitable part of this planet. And our closest evolutionary relatives, chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, are counted in the hundreds of thousands and are restricted to, say, just parts of Africa or parts of Asia. And in a sense, we all know what happened. It was human culture, human technology that allowed us to, if you like, transcend the ecological niche that we lived in. And that happened during these sort of 6, 7, 8 million years since we share a common ancestor with the apes. But what is very often overlooked, I think, is that it didn't happen over all of that time. It actually happened very, very recently. If we look on other human forms that existed 1 million years ago or so, they were not that different from the apes. They were very restricted in their distribution. There were perhaps tens or hundreds of thousands of them that existed. And this becomes particularly obvious if we look on our very closest evolutionary relatives, which are extinct, which are the Neanderthals. So the Neanderthals, they appear in the fossil record in the form of skeletons that paleontologists will excavate somewhere 300,000–400,000 years ago. And then they become extinct around 30,000 years ago. So they exist during 300,000 years or so. And if you look at the stone tools that the Neanderthals made at the beginning of their history and towards the end of their history, around 30,000 years ago, they are pretty much exactly the same stone tools, over 300,000 years. And then modern humans come on the stage, starting in Africa a little over 100,000 years ago and expanding out of Africa starting 50–60,000 years ago. And in that short time, that is then 3 or 5 times shorter than Neanderthals existed, I think we can all agree, particularly at this meeting, that technology and society has changed a tremendous amount. And obviously it has to do with cognitive capacities, our ability to develop society and technology and culture. And it came about very, very quickly, in just 100,000 years or so. And now I'm sort of fascinated by this question, since we have now, since a year and a half, we have the information to begin to address what may have happened in humans that set us on this very, very special trajectory. Since, as John alluded to, we have now sequenced the complete genome to very high quality of a Neanderthal. We've also sequenced the genome of these Denisovans, a sister group of Neanderthals. So we can line up the entire, almost entire genome of a Neanderthal next to the genome of thousands of people that live on the planet today that one has also sequenced. And we can begin to look for the changes that we all have in common. So not things where we differ. I will differ from someone in this room at around 3 million places in my genome. But we are not interested in those. We are interested in the things that we all share in this room and on the entire planet, but where we differ from the Neanderthals. And the Neanderthal look like the chimpanzees and the orangs and the other apes. So we want to look at the things that we all have in common, yet differ from our very closest evolutionary relative. If you like, it's a genetic recipe for being a fully modern human. And the fascinating thing is that if we now list all these things in the genome, have this catalog of these changes, there are not that many. There are around 30,000, 31,000 single letters in the genetic code that have changed, in 3 billion such letters. And around 10,000 losses and gains of a few letters next to each other. So it's actually a list that's short enough that you and I can actually scroll through it and look at it. So that's really fascinating. We have this information. But we, of course, come to the dirty little secret of genomics. And there's a lot of hype about genomics these days. And what is true is that we have a tremendous capacity to sequence DNA. We can sequence the genomes of hundreds of thousands of people today, inexpensively and quickly. We have all that information, but we are terribly bad at interpreting it. You can say preciously little about how I look, how I think, or how I behave when you look at my genome sequence. Now, I'm convinced that that will change in the next few years, but we are now staring also on this list of 30,000 changes and ask ourselves, somewhere among these 30,000 ones are probably hiding the things that set humans on this very special track. But we don't know which. We're, of course, trying to look at it and start to figure out things. If we, for example, ask for which changes actually change building blocks in proteins, so the molecules that actually do jobs in our bodies, that are enzymes, that build up our tissues and so on, that ends up being just 96 such changes. 96 such changes in 87 proteins, because a few proteins have several changes. So we're particularly interested in looking at those, for example, and also changes that may change how genes are active, which genes are turned on, when and where, in what tissues. So this is just something that is starting. It's something that, when we now have published the genome, many groups in the world will look at. And an interesting thing to discuss, maybe here, or think about is, how will we go after this? I don't know if I should go into that too. So the question is, should we sort of go into how we could imagine to go after these questions in the next few years? I suppose we should. So there are people out there, George Church, for example, in Boston, who says we should recreate a Neanderthal. He even has been quoted as saying he's looking for an adventurous woman who would bear the first Neanderthal child. And I think that's sort of probably driven a little by the wish to be provocative and for getting attention. At many, many levels, that's ridiculous. Technically, we cannot engineer in 30,000 changes in a genome today, leaving aside all the ethical issues that we would never create a sentient human being just for scientific interest, of course. But there are things we can imagine to do. So there are ways that was for example, these induced pluripotent stem cells that Professor Yamanaka got a Nobel Prize for the year before last, where you can now take skin cells from any human and induce them to become de-differentiated, and then you have a cell line that you can differentiate into essentially any tissue in the body. So something we're sort of beginning to do is to make such cells from humans and from apes. And then we can imagine that we can introduce these changes, the human-specific changes in a chimpanzee cell line, and the ancestral form, the ape-like Neanderthal form in human such cell lines, and differentiate them. So I think one can imagine in the next few years that one, for example, creates a little liver in a Petri dish that is humanized and is Neanderthalized, and actually compare how they function. And there was, of course, a paper from Vienna published this year, where they have used such cell lines to create small, what they call organoids. So there are little tiny brains, or things that are similar to brains, in the test tube from such cells. So we could also perhaps begin to ask, what of these changes have a function in the brain? So that's sort of one direction I see this go in the next few years.
Let's hold off on questions until Anton speaks.
Yeah, when my old friend John Brockman told me that he will asked me to ask the question which I am most interested in, I was frightened because there are so many questions I am most interested in. But there's one which sticks out and which actually directly connects to what we have heard here. And that is the following. I mean, we humans are, as we have heard in some sketchy way, I understand, the product of evolution, including this little soup up there called the brain. Now, this brain was formed, that's at least the way I would see it, by the necessity of our forefathers and foremothers to survive. Those whose brains made the wrong decision about the saber-toothed tiger following them did not become our ancestors, to put it in a simple way. Now, if you look at this human, then something, we don't know when, but it must have been at least 20,000 years ago or whatever, that humans started to wonder about the world. They started to look up at the sky, they saw the stars, they wanted to understand what this is. This must be long before written records existed, because in the first written records you have people wondering about this kind of thing. So this is already interesting. Why does our brain have the capability to wonder about these things which are apparently useless? It's apparently useless for a person living 10,000 years ago to know what the stars are, what they're not are. And it goes on. It certainly goes on like that. We have, as you all know, we have in ancient Greece, we had the first attempts to understand what goes on a quantitative way with some spectacular results. But then in the Renaissance, a real big revolution happened. A revolution which is probably still underappreciated in its importance. It's the invention of mathematical science. It's the discovery that mathematics provides an extremely precise method to describe and analyze what happens. And people usually underappreciate how precise everything is. Everyone who steps into an airplane relies on the validity of a law discovered by Bernoulli, which describes the forces produced by a flowing liquid body. Air is also a liquid body in that sense. To a few percent, to incredible precision. And it goes on like that. We discovered later on laws in relativity theory and in quantum mechanics, modern physics, laws which actually completely run against at least the intuition of people who discovered them. And that's absolutely marvelous. This apparatus up there has discovered methods to understand the world in a mathematical sense, which are counterintuitive, which run against what this apparatus up there originally was built for. But it turns out that these logical conclusions are correct. It turns out, as we know, relativity theory, the E equals mc squared, that there is an equivalence between mass and energy, or in quantum mechanics, where we describe the behavior of small particles, individual particles originally, or individual atoms. It turns out that what we do there mathematically is incredibly precise, even as the fundamental concepts, in my opinion, are not really understood yet. But that doesn't matter. This machine up there is so powerful that we found something which nature tells us is a correct description of what goes on. So why is this? In my opinion, any machine, any device, any information gathering device, which is able to make sufficiently complex decisions, which led to us in the evolution, at some point must lead to be such a general purpose machine that it can also do things which it intuitively does not understand, which leads to modern science, and which also leads to something else. And that something else is, I started, as you remember, I started with, this person living 10 or 20,000 years ago and wondering about the stars. Most of science started because somebody was wondering about something. Sheer wondering. Most of the fundamental science did not start because somebody wanted to build this device or that device and so on. When people invented relativity theory, nobody had the idea that you need it in your navigation system in the car. Nobody. This idea was not around. When quantum mechanics was invented, nobody had an idea that it was important to understand how computers work, semiconductors and so on. And this is the third miracle. It's the miracle that starting something where only the curiosity is our guiding star in the beginning, we find something which is suddenly useful to build a new technology. The fourth question, which I'm interested in, which is related to this, is doing this kind of research, doing this kind of thinking. We have developed models about the world where we have what we call parameters. Which means that we can change the features of the world a little bit. We can, for example, imagine a world where the Earth, the planet Earth, is not at the distance of 150 million kilometers from Sun, but 200 million. In such a model, we would not have us as living people on planet Earth, or maybe 300 million, doesn't matter. It's even more fascinating. If you change the little parameters like the relative mass of the electron and the proton, which makes up all of us, change the masses a little bit, we would not exist. And there are many parameters like that. There are many features in the world which are tuned in such a way that if they were slightly different, no life would exist, we would not exist, and so on. And that's again fascinating. We as humans were able to build up models of the universe, of which models, and now in string theory they have 10 to the 500 different ones, which is a number beyond any imagination. Only one of them really works. Why is that? Firstly, why were we able, using this machine, to get such results? Because the machine was not built for that purpose. And secondly, what does all this... Oops. What does all this... Yeah, this brings luck, yeah? Right. But this guy has a lot of luck. I want to conclude simply that with all the success of science, some of the very deep questions which we started to embark on 10 or 20,000 years ago are still very open. And that's the big fascination of doing science.
Right off the top, some questions that
or
I'm
maybe
sure people are thinking about.
Oh, sorry.
How are you going to play God? And what are you going to do for the NSA with quantum cryptography? I'm just getting started.
Is this a real question?
Well,
it is.
Part of your work is quantum cryptography. The NSA has announced they're working on a quantum computer.
Well, this was not a surprise in the community, because everybody was basically, no proof, but everybody in a sense knows that. I mean, to the solution would be simple. I would make all information public to anyone. That's it. Not only NSA, everybody. Everything should be published to anyone. That would really change the world, wouldn't it?
But it's not going to work for credit card companies or people that need to keep financial stuff private. And so Buckminster Fuller used to say that today's weapon system becomes tomorrow's washing machine. So to what extent is the pure research that you're doing going to find its way into products generation from now?
Well, yes, we are talking about what is called the second quantum revolution. The first quantum revolution happened around 1930 when people discovered that this new theory allows us to explain, like, semiconductors, magnetism, atoms, and so on and so on. And a lot of technology is built on that. Probably at least 50% of the GDP of modern societies is built on that. The second quantum revolution now builds on quantum behavior of individual particles, and there we talk about quantum cryptography, which, if it's done right, allows you to encode information in a way that nobody can crack it, no matter what he or she knows, it doesn't matter. And secondly, quantum computers, which work in a completely different realm. About quantum cryptography, the situation is such that the basic phenomena are proven, and but the data rates and the distances are extremely low. And this, in my conviction, is only a matter of technology. There's no fundamental reason why we shouldn't be enormously better. But it costs a lot of money, and the problem is that the present security industry is satisfied with the systems they have. If that changes, then quantum cryptography will be on the thing.
And quantum teleportation?
Well,
beam me up, Scotty.
Quantum teleportation is a way to transfer the information from one system to another, transfer it from one to another, not make a copy over there, but take all the information out there. So if I take Mr. Burda, I would take all the information which defines the positions of the atoms and so on out of that quantum system and transfer it to some other quantum system, which is made of new atoms. But if the information transfer is completely, Herr Burda would disappear here, not here anymore, and we have a new Herr Burda made of different atoms at a new location. That's the basic idea. Now, quantum teleportation is far from being feasible for any system as complex as Herr Burda, but it works for photons, for small particles. And why is this interesting? Because it's a way for future quantum computers to talk to each other. So it's a new technology system which has a conceptually interesting feature that is not shared by any existing communication system. If in any existing system, and this is philosophically interesting, the information, when you have it here at A and you want it there at B, it has to travel along some path. Or maybe at multiple paths at the same time, but it has to travel from here to there. Not so in quantum teleportation. It disappears here and shows up there. So it's a way of sending information without it following a path at the time. And that's conceptually really fascinating that this is possible.
Svante, it's not 20 years ago that Ian Wilmot cloned Dolly, and there was a worldwide hubbub that this should be banned and in no way done other than complete experimentally, scientifically overviewed projects. Yesterday in the news, there was a show from China where they are doing factory-level cloning of pigs. You know, and with all the ensuing problems that Wilmot and his colleagues discovered with telomeres and premature aging, there's a funny thing about technology. You'll be hearing from Evgeny Maratov, who's a critic of a lot of everything that's happening these days. The way I look at it, people in the tech world say that if it can be done, it will be done, and it is good, and you will like it. So I jokingly said, how you're going to answer questions about playing God, and you're not going to play God because you talk about doing this research to help with medical analysis of humans and curing diseases, and George Church in Boston talks about the same stuff. But there will be people that will say they can, even though you say it's not possible, and I trust you, that are going to try to do strange experiments. And how do you deal with that? And how does that affect your work? Because if somebody's mouthing off about mating this lady with that Neanderthal that they've cloned, what happens in Leipzig?
So your question was, how do we deal with the...
How do you carry on as a pure scientist when there'll be all kinds of public journalistic pressures, to do science fiction?
Well, I think there is a lot of pressure also not to clone Neanderthals and not create them, right? I think that it's both for technical and ethical reasons that we all agree to, at least in the developed world, it's really untenable to try to create sentient human beings. We don't even do that to cure diseases, right? We sort of do somatic gene therapy, we fix genes in the tissues of an individual, but there is, and that what will probably change, but at the moment we don't change the germline. I think it will come that there will be some consensus to change some mutations that are obviously bad in the human germline to allow people to have healthy children. But I think we are way beyond my lifetime and the lifetime of my children before anyone would say they write a grant proposal to some funding agency to put these 30,000 changes into a human baby and see what the Neanderthal would be like. And I hope it will never happen, really.
How about some questions?
Can I gab along a little if there are no questions? Are there questions?
It's so overwhelming what you just talk about, that the audience, the intelligent audience, forgot to ask any questions. Svante, where will you be in 5 years? What are your next big goal to achieve, and how do you do it?
Well, I think that one goal is clearly to go back further in time. So we now looked at Neanderthals and their relatives that are around 100,000 years old. We just published in December that we have been able to get a little bit of DNA from human fossils that are 400,000 years old in Spain, just a part of the genome. The next goal is clearly to try to get larger parts of the genome, so we could look at other human forms than Neanderthals and Denisovans. And then I think it's really to systematically study these 30,000 changes one after the other, obviously starting with the ones that we think are the most interesting ones. And something that strikes me when we talk about the human brain here is that it's very tempting to say that what happened with modern humans 100,000 years ago is that our individual brains got much, much better, that we got better cognition, became smarter. That's possible, but I think there's another idea out there that also seems rather plausible, and that is that human sociality changed, that something changed in our brains that made us much more geared towards forming big societies. That's something that also comes with modern humans, that we seem to form bigger groups. It comes things like figurative art, that when only modern humans start depicting other humans on cave paintings, for example. And there is this idea that what made innovation increase so much is that we formed much, much bigger units where we could build on each other's knowledge much more efficiently. And this ratchet effect that one talks about, that an engineer today that will improve a piece of software or an automobile, she will of course not invent things from the beginning. She will just improve on what is there, add her tweaks to it, and we will have a better product. And this is something that became possible, according to one idea, in these bigger societies. And that's why one can imagine that things such as the internet and communication these days will sort of inspire or lead to another quantum leap in innovation. So one thing we are very interested in, for example, are genes involved in autism. There is an idea that autism affects precisely this sort of way of putting ourselves in other people's shoes and forming big societies, politics, and so on. The fact that when I sit here and talk to you, worry in essence much more about what you guys think about me than any content in what I say. Whereas a Neanderthal that would sit here or a chimpanzee would just do their thing and not worry about what others think about themselves. This is somehow a little blocking us often in our communication, but it's also the thing that makes lying, that makes politics, that make big societies possible. So I think maybe the things we will find is actually things that has to do with human sort of sociality in the end of this endeavor, in 5 years perhaps. My short answer to that would really be no, I do not think so. Of course, evolution goes on all the time. Evolution is simply the differential survival and reproduction of all of us that automatically goes on. But in some sense, I think that when we ask a question like that, we are thinking about important traits that sort of matter for how we live our lives or how our societies change. And I would still contend that from 30, 40,000 years ago, cultural evolution had become so much faster that biological evolution had become irrelevant for these important things. Sometimes to illustrate this, I just say, if the automobile and traffic have led to that traffic accident is a big risk for our children. We are not waiting for mutations that make our children be more cautious when they cross the street. We invent crosswalks, we tell them to look left and right, we have laws about how we drive. So it's a cultural response to cultural threat. And that's really what it is. Important, I think.
Yes. Anton, we heard more and more about quantum computing. We heard about the NSA. We know that Google and the NASA is working on quantum computing. Can you explain us in very simple terms what it is?
Well, we have 5 minutes and 36 seconds. I will try to do it in that time. No, I'm just joking. This is a very important question because a first statement, quantum computing is the first kind of computing which we invented in history, which has no analog, as far as we know, and operates to completely different principles. And the principles are what is called quantum superposition. While a classical bit can be 0 or 1, a quantum bit can be 0 and 1. Two bits can be connected with each other over a large distance, and you can have systems which carry different kinds of information at the same time. And these notions together allow that some calculations are done on a quantum computer which would be of what we call exponential complexity on a classical computer. One of the ideas is factoring large numbers. On the physical realization, you need individual quantum systems which you are able to connect with each other. This can be photons, this can be individual particles, it can be atoms, it can be superconducting qubits, and so on. And one of the big open questions is whether this might play some role up there, which most physicists don't believe, in the brain. But then the next question is, do we have enough physics to understand what goes on here?
Svante Pääbo. Svante? I would like to know more about your concept of information. Is it correct to say, from the point of genetics, evolution is a copy shop? Yeah. Evolution, maybe, if is a copy shop. But when you copy something, you make mistakes. And then you copy the mistake and the error. And therefore, in information theory, we speak about noise and error. What is the role of noise and error in your theory?
Well, I think, of course, the essence of the sort of raw material of evolution are, of course, copying errors in our genetic information. Every baby that is born carries in the order of 100 to 200 new mutations. So features that are not there, neither in the mother nor in the father, that are simply errors that have been made. The vast majority of those have no consequences. Many of them that happen lead to premature death. We may not even know that we were pregnant. And others lead to, very rarely, to new abilities that may even be beneficial, once in a million times, perhaps. So.
Anton, I'm a biologist and neuroscientist, and I always wanted to know, like why principles which are valid for mathematics, which work on computers and even on small particles, would not be available for the biological world of neurons. Why can we not use it in biology?
That is a very good question if you talk about quantum laws. That is a very good question. The answer, the presently understood answer, is a twofold one. Firstly, quantum states are very fragile. So in this environment up there, which is at a high temperature from a physics point of view, quantum states would not survive for a long time, firstly. And secondly, in evolution, every intermediate step would have to survive. It would have to some advantage for survival. Now, I can see a situation where having a quantum computer up there would be advantageous, but I cannot see a path which leads there, where small individual quantum computing elements would be of an advantage. But maybe this is just the limit of my fantasy.
Hi. I want to follow up on my neighbor's question and ask you about, you mentioned autism and we mentioned some errors, mutations. Are you looking at impact of environment, socioeconomic, and all the other things that actually can cause those errors or mutations? Because we see spikes in certain chronic diseases.
So, of course, we don't really work with diseases. We really work with evolution, comparisons to Neanderthals. My really understanding of it is that mutations happen spontaneously. Part of these spikes in diseases we may see may also be changes in the environment that make certain changes now appear as a disease in our culture. In some diseases, it's pretty obvious that that is the case. If we think about type 2 diabetes, so the type of diabetes one has in old age, didn't exist in Germany in 46, 47, 48. It simply doesn't exist if you starve. It's something that comes in an environment where you have continuous and high levels of nutrition. And with some other things like this, may be the same thing, that it's actually an environment. These mutations probably happened all the time, but it might be at least part of the explanation for this, that the environment of made certain features become diseases.
Last question.
Hi. Quick question. The tools that we're building are also evolving quite quicker today than they did, say, 20,000 years ago. So there is an evolution of technology. What have you reflected on the impact that that might have on our ability to survive? You mentioned cultural evolution having a big role. Technological evolution probably has one as well. Have you reflected on this?
Not more insightfully that any one of you could reflect on that, really. I'm an optimist, though. I do think that the problems we see can be solved by humans. We've done such an amazing history of innovation and progress, and I think we will solve these things.
Anton, Svante, thank you.
I fully agree with that.